Have you visited in the past?
Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Many times over the years. Far too many, because it makes me realize how old I am.
Mm-hmm.
I still remember back the days when everyone was up on the hill. So,
Mm-hmm.
is that where your office typically is?
Yeah, so all of CGD is at the Mesa Lab.
Right.
Still, yep.
Yeah, the people I collaborate with are a combination of people in CGD and people in the atmospheric chemistry.
Mm-hmm.
And then some of them seem to have two offices, so I'm never sure exactly. They go backwards and forwards.
Yeah. And I know a couple of folks in your department from grad school. So Maya Gomes was my office mate at one point.
Oh, okay.
And I know Emmy Smith as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. They both, ended up there. They started around the same time. And I think they even partially share a lab.
Yeah, I think they've each got their own labs, but then they're using equipment in each other's labs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So grad school was where?
Yeah, so we were all at Harvard.
Okay.
Emmy and I were PhD students, and Maya was a postdoc there. We overlapped, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Also an Earth and Planetary Sciences department, yeah.
Yes, one of the few that were out there.
So very broad department, yeah.
Hopkins can actually make the claim to be the first Earth and Planetary Science department in the US.
Really?
Yeah, I only realized that. Must have been last year or year before we had an anniversary, and it's a 50-year anniversary. Yeah.
Wow, so it's quite old, yeah, for the US, yeah.
Well, it was a kind of merger together of different. I mean, there's older departments that cover the breadth, but the use of the name Earth and Planetary Sciences comes from there. So.
Mm.
Yeah, and there's people at Harvard in atmospheric science or ocean side that I know as well. So,
Mm-hmm.
So you're doing, what's your position at INCA?
I'm a project scientist. I work on uncertainty quantification and modeling land atmosphere interactions. At Harvard, I worked with Dan Schrag, so I'm not a geochemist, but I have a little bit of that exposure just from the sort of being in a broad department.
So you're doing modeling for your PhD?
Yeah, I was, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, so we'll just wait a few more minutes before we get started.
Yeah, that's fine. Just giving remote seminars it's good that you can easily give seminars in different places, but talking to a blank screen takes a little bit to get used to.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I mean, well, you do it now for teaching as well, and
yeah.
It's hard to get any feedback when you can't see most of the people.
Mm-hmm.
Darren, I was just waving at you just to make sure that we are here and you see us. So.
Oh, now I see you. You had to speak. Waving's not enough. The
Hi,
computer
Darren.
can't,
Good gent.
hi, Peter. The computer can't sense that people are waving.
Not yet, anyway.
Hello, Darren. How you doing?
Oh, come to learn some oceanography, have you?
Yeah.
You're in the wrong place.
Mhm.
Are you sitting in your basement or is this your office?
No, that's my basement. Basement
Yeah.
office.
Yeah. I'm taking over the house here. I've got a basement upstairs and a office upstairs and one in the basement as well, depending on temperature and noise.
hmm Well, my dog gets to hang out with me down here, so it's not too lonely.
Ah. Yeah, we don't have any pets, but we've talked multiple times about getting another dog. So
Cool. So I think we have a good group ready to go. If you're ready, we can get started, Darren.
sure, fine with me.
Great. So welcome, everyone. Happy to introduce Dr. Darren Wah as our seminar speaker today. Dr. Wah is a professor in Earth and Planetary Sciences at Johns Hopkins University. He received his bachelor's and master's in mathematics and physics from the University of Waikato in New Zealand in 1987, and his PhD in applied mathematics from Cambridge University in the UK in 1991. He was a postdoc at MIT and a research scientist at Monash University before joining Johns Hopkins in 1998. His research interests include large-scale dynamics and transport in the atmosphere and oceans, including controls on the distribution of trace constituents. His group studies a wide range of global environmental issues, including stratospheric ozone depletion, climate change, air pollution, and urban heat. Today, he will speak about revisiting trends in Southern Hemisphere westerlies and their impact on the oceans. So Darren, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks. So I should, I guess, share my screen if I can find the window. I assume everyone can see this.
Yeah, it looks good, and you can do full screen if you like.
If I can find it. Too many things in my window.
Great, it looks good.
Okay, thanks. Well, thanks for the invitation and for showing up remotely wherever you are around Colorado or the rest of the world. So today I was going to try to update you in some work I've been involved with over the last couple of years, revisiting some trends in the Southern Hemisphere. And this kind of brings together some of my background in stratospheric dynamics and my more recent interest in pretending to be an oceanographer. So this will combine aspects of those together. So I'm just going to give an overview of the southern annular mode and some of these trends in the Southern Hemisphere. And in the first half, I'm going to discuss some recent studies kind of revisiting these trends. And then the second, half, or it's less than a half, will be some speculation about possible impacts on the Southern Oceans, on the Southern Ocean. Okay, so I'm assuming that most of you know, but I'll carry on just in case not. The Southern annular mode is a mode of climate variability in the Southern Hemisphere, and it's a leading mode of variability on a range of timescales. And it corresponds to a kind of north-south shift in the atmospheric mass. So in its positive phase, there is a lower pressure over Antarctica and higher pressure over mid-latitudes. And that change in pressure ends up having a result or an associated change in the strength and the latitude of the peak westerlies. So when you have a lower pressure over Antarctica, there tends to be stronger westerly flow there and weaker over the mid-latitudes. So that corresponds generally to a strengthening of the jet and it's shifting poleward. And then once you have the change in the winds, That then has an impact on weather systems, precipitation, and even the Hadley cell extent. So when there's in the positive phase, there's a shift in the winds, there's a fewer storms over, there should be a couple of little islands under here. I have to find out who made this plot. It's missing, it's impacted by this fluctuation in the SAM. The SAM also, this variability in the shift in the winds also has an impact on the oceans. This is a schematic which has got a lot of information on it, but the key point is that the atmospheric variability in terms of the winds as well as the cloudiness has an impact on the wind stress and also the buoyancy flux into the ocean. So that has an impact on the kind of mixed layer depth, on the Ekman transport, which results in a change in the downwelling or upwelling, change in the density structure, and in the kind of potentially the uptake of heat and carbon by the oceans. So there's this coupling, it couples back, and there's also a potential impact on the sea ice. So there's been lots of observations that have shown over the last few decades that this annular mode has been trending towards its positive phase, which corresponds to a strengthening and a poleward shift of these westerly winds, with this trend being the strongest in southern summer, December, January, February. So the plot on the left is showing the change in the geopotential height at 500 hectopascals between this, I guess, the early 2000s to around 1980. So there's a decrease in the geopotential height over the Antarctica and an increase, pretty annular in structure, around 40 to 50 south. This is for at one level at December, January, February. The plot on the right is showing the 30-year trends in geopotential from radio zones over Antarctica over this kind of time period versus its height or pressure versus month of the year. The shaded region is when there's been a significant decrease or significant change. So at 500, you see this change that's shown on the plot on the left. This shows that this extends all the way from the stratosphere down to the surface. The significant changes are occurring in December, January, February. And as I said, associated with that change in the geopotential, there's a change in the east-west winds in the troposphere and the stratosphere. So the plot on the left is, again, it's a trend from a reanalysis, December, January, February, showing pressure versus latitude. The contours, if you can see them, are the climatological winds. So this is the jet sitting here with the maximum winds at each latitude, and the colors are showing the change over this period. And so there's a strengthening of the winds equatorward of the peak and a decrease, an increase poleward of the peak and a decrease on the equatorward side. So that results in the peak winds getting stronger and shifting towards the pole. And the bottom plot shows the latitude of the peak winds. In December, January, February, they've moved towards the pole. In southern winter, there hasn't been a significant change. So the change in geopotential height is called a strengthening and a poleward shift of the jet. And associated with that, there's been a shift in the poleward edge of the Hadley cell. There have been changes in the precipitation over southern mid-latitudes. And if you look at weather systems, say cut-off flows, there's been an increase in their frequency over this period. This doesn't mean that there's causality in there, but there's a series of changes that have been occurring that are all at least consistent. So the general conclusion that's come out of a wide range of studies is that over this period, there's been a poleward shift of the atmospheric circulation during southern summer, with the Hadley cell expanding, the jet stream and associated precipitation moving poleward. And the ocean has also seen lots of changes over this period. some of which are at least consistent and have been linked to these changes in the winds. So this includes the strength of the subtropical gyres. So it's difficult to see here, but this is a plot of showing different periods from mid-1990s to 2000s. And so this deepening of the color shows a strengthening of the subtropical gyre over the Pacific. There's been an increase in the ocean heat content through these southern kind of mid-latitudes. And if you can estimate the kind of age of the water, so the mean time since it's been at the surface, within these kind of subtropical mode waters, it has gotten younger, while it's gotten older in some other places. So these changes are all kind of qualitatively consistent with what might happen with a strengthening of the wind stress. So I guess the summary there is we have a very clean picture that I think you read lots of places about the strengthening and poleward shift of the westerly winds. It's caused changes in weather patterns, ocean circulation, and even uptake of carbon and heat. But I've asked the question, is it really that simple? And of course, I'm going to say that it's not, otherwise it would be a very short talk. So over the last couple of years, with collaborators, we've been looking at, well, have these trends continued and are they kind of spatially uniform? So this year there's been a couple of papers, one on the temporal variation and a recent one on trends between the different ocean basins. I'm going to try and kind of summarize these. So we'll start with the issue of the pause, or has that trend continued? So we're going to focus on December, January, February, because that's when the strongest trends in the SAM and the winds. And so the first question, have these robust trends continued? And if you look at the reanalyses, the answer is no. So these plots here are showing panel B is the jet position, C is the index of this annular mode, and D is the extent of the Hadley cell. And these are based on 4 or 5 reanalyses. And you can see in the first half of this record, there's a clear poleward movement of the Hadley cell and the jet, and the SAM has moved more towards a positive phase. But since around 2000, there's still lots of variability, but there's very little trend over this period. And so you could imagine this as there's a downward trend until around 2000, and that trend has kind of paused, maybe even some indication that it's heading back towards the equator. And this wasn't really a total surprise, because around 2000 was also when there's been a change in stratospheric ozone. So one of the causes, I'll come back to this later, for this trend is thought to be the ozone formation of the ozone hole, which causes a cooling in the lower stratosphere, which then it's a large cooling that has an impact on the tropospheric jet and the SAM. And so this poleward shift has been associated with the formation of the ozone hole. And ozone was going down, but since around 2000, it's kind of been bouncing around again, with a hint that it might be starting to recover. And this change in ozone can be then linked to changes. The red curve is the stratospheric chlorine. So this is the main driver of the ozone depletion. So it's on an inverse scale. So the amount of chlorine has been increasing. It's been regulated since the 1990s. It's peaked in the polar stratosphere around 2000 and is now slowly going back to 1980 or 1970 values. So there's a consistent decrease in chlorine, ozone hole growth has stopped, and then there's been a corresponding kind of pause in the trends in the tropospheric circulation. Of course, this is just at one level, but if we can use the reanalyses to look at the trends versus pressure. So this is pressure versus latitude plot. Again, the contours are the climatological values. The shading shows the trend. This first plot is showing the depletion period, so that's up to 2000. The second is showing from 2000 on, and the third panel is showing the difference between those. So there's a strong trend up to 2000, weak positive and negative trends since then. And so there's been a large kind of decrease in the trend between these two periods. So then, given that, this seems consistent with the pause in the growth of the ozone hole, but there's lots of other things changing as well. So we've used models to try and see if we can understand the cause of this change. So the first thing we want to do is see whether these models can reproduce the pause. And so what's shown here, the second row is from a large ensemble with the CAN ESM. So this is one model where they changed initial conditions and did, I think, 40 different runs. And whereas the bottom row is showing a multi-model ensemble. So these are the chemistry climate models from CCMI. So Wacom is one of the models that's in here. And so this is an average of a group of models. This is the average of different runs for the same model. And they both show significant trends in up to 2000, virtually no trends since then in this large change. And we've chosen both the CCMI Ensemble and the CAN ESM is because both these ensembles also did other runs, single forcing runs, where either only ozone varied or only greenhouse gases varied. And so if we take the CCM Ensemble, so this is from the top plot, top row is just this bottom row here. So that's with all the forcings in. The middle is when the greenhouse gases are fixed. So ozone changes, but not CO2, etc. And the bottom row is when ozone, stratospheric ozone is fixed, but the greenhouse gases change. When in fact here, it wasn't ozone, it was fixed. This sort of had fixed CFCs, which ended up meaning that ozone didn't change. Anyhow, the point is that when you have ozone varying, you reproduce this large difference in the trends before and after 2000. But when you have ozone fixed, you get you get an increasing trend because of the greenhouse gases. So this indicates that this pause has indeed been because of changes in ozone and not changes in the greenhouse gases. Okay, so the kind of summary of this is the December, January, February wind and SAM trends have paused around 2000, and that pause has happened because of the start of the recovery of the ozone hole. Okay, so that's the temporal variations in these trends, but what about between regions or even between seasons? So the focus has been primarily on the zonal mean winds, but if you start thinking about the impact on, say, oceans, and you're thinking of, say, the ocean subtropical gyres, they're potentially going to worry more about the winds or the wind stress averaged over a basin rather than the zonal mean winds. And they might depend more on the annual mean or even longer timescales than trends in one particular season. So we've gone back to the reanalyses and looked at this. First of all, I consider just the annual mean winds. Again, because for the ocean, most ocean processes, this is probably what's going to be important, or some at least. And this shows from 3 different reanalyses the trend in the strength of the maximum winds over this 1980 to current day. This is the zonal mean. So again, there is a pause that's in here, but I've just fit these with a linear over the whole period for simplicity. The middle plot is showing the Pacific, and the third is showing the average over the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. So you see that there has been a strengthening in the zonal winds, and that strengthening's come primarily from the Pacific, with only a very weak strengthening over the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. If we then go and look where this maximum has been occurring, in the zonal mean, there's been this poleward shift. So again, this is the well-reported kind of strengthening and poleward shift. But now when you look over the Pacific, you see it hasn't moved, the peak winds haven't moved poleward. If anything, they've moved equatorward. Whereas the Atlantic Indian Ocean, there has been a significant poleward movement. So the zonal mean strengthening and poleward movement is actually coming from different sectors. So the strengthening is coming primarily from the Pacific, and the poleward movement's coming primarily from the Atlantic and Indian Oceans. So that's potentially relevant for looking at how the ocean circulation might respond. It actually turns out that this change in this between these sectors is a combination of differences in the trend in the winds and differences in the climatological structure of the winds. So the plot on the left is showing a spatial map of the wind trends. And so you see the largest increase is over the Pacific than over the other sectors. And you also see that the Pacific increase is slightly poleward of where it's increasing over the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. And combined with that, the peak winds are further equatorward over the Atlantic than they are over the Pacific. So you have the difference in trends is because the Pacific winds are strengthening further equatorward and the mean jet is further poleward. So that both those factors act that the winds here will move towards the equator, whereas here the peak winds will move towards the pole. And then we can go and look at this in seasonally to see where this come from. So focusing on the Pacific, we have this, this is the annual mean change in the winds, but you can see that the Pacific strengthening comes primarily from December, January, February, whereas the fact that it moves slightly equatorward comes primarily from September, October, November. So in the summer, the peak winds over the Pacific are moving poleward as they are in the other oceans, but in September, October, November, there's actually a equatorward shift. And this equatorward shift kind of dominates in the annual mean. So what's the cause of these trends? So is it forcing or is it internal variability or some combination? So now I've again gone back to looking at models. Now we're looking at, again, at a multi-model ensemble, in fact, CMAP5 and the CMAP6, as well as single model ensembles by CAN-ESM and the CSM large ensemble. And again, so this is combining single runs of different models, and the other ones are combining 40 or so runs of individual models. So this is what's shown here. This is a terrible plot, so let's see if I can go over it. So this is showing, the top plot showing the strength of the peak winds, the bottom plot showing the latitude. The first kind of third is showing the annual mean winds. The middle is December, January, February, and the right is September, October, November, because these are the key kind of seasons where there's a difference. And for each season or annual mean, there's three groups of points. One's for the zonal mean, one's for the Pacific, and one's for the Atlantic Indian Ocean averages. There's lots of detail here, I should say. And then the black diamonds, if you can see them, are the reanalyses, and the kind of bar whisker plots are showing the 4 different model ensembles. At this stage, the key point to take across is that the reanalyses, so the observed kind of change, is falling within the model spread. So they're not all, they can be very different than the mean of the models, but within the model ensembles, they can capture this observed trend. So it seems that if we want to go in now and look at the causality, at least these models can seem to capture what's happened. So first, just quickly looking at December, January, February. And again, we've already showed when we were looking at the trends there, that ozone and greenhouse gases were playing a major role, and you see that for these ensembles as well. So the point here is that the models show a consistent poleward movement, whether it's zonal mean or different sectors, and nearly all the models are moving poleward. There are some that still move equatorward. It's because this is not totally a forced response, but it's showing there's a major forced response because the models are showing the same sign in terms of strengthening and shift. So this is saying that it's due to some forcing that's in there, and you can then go and use the single forcing runs. This is from the CAN-ESM, and the green and blue are showing the natural forcing or the anthropogenic aerosols. And in all cases, that's basically the model mean is 0. So over this period, they haven't caused a forced response. But then when you look at ozone or the inferred greenhouse gas, you start to see that there is a contribution from these. So the shift has come from ozone and greenhouse gases. The strengthening looks to, for this model, come primarily from greenhouse gases. But anyhow, the key result of the December, January, February trends and the pause that we've discussed earlier come from ozone and greenhouse gases. But what about September, October, November? If we go and look at this now, again, these are busy plots. So the red box is the season to focus on. And the key point is that, well, there's two things. So the reanalysis and the mean of the models don't always agree on the sign, but the models are indicating there isn't much of a forced trend, but there's very large ensemble spread, especially over the Pacific. And so that's, and the reanalyses fall within that. So the equator, the changes in the peak winds or the latitude of this is within the kind of spread of the models. So this indicates that this is not a forced response, but more from some internal variability. You can look at that a couple of other ways. One is you can look at the 4 times CO2 runs that have been done for CMEP5. So these are runs where there's a large increase in the CO2, and you can see, so they, in December, January, February, this is the red symbols, that's caused a large poleward shift in the strengthening of the winds. But when you look in September, October, November, there's again a strengthening of the winds, but the movement, especially over the Pacific, is there's no significant movement, and it's kind of indicating that even if you increase CO2 by 4 times pre-industrial, there's still not a significant shift in the winds over the Pacific. So that indicates that CO2 is not likely to be the cause of the observed shift in the Pacific during that season. And we've also gone and compared the AMEP and historical. And again, there's not much difference between them. They have the similar kind of structure of no mean, multi-model mean shift, but large variability that encompasses the observations. And in fact, the AMEP runs, which have exactly the same SSTs in all the models, produces a larger variability in terms of jet location than the historical runs where the SSTs vary within each model. So this is suggesting that actually internal atmospheric dynamics could be a major driver of this variability in September through November. So that's the first part, is this analysis of the trends that have occurred in terms of the winds. And I guess the take-home message is that there's been a pause around 2000 that we can link to the start of the ozone hole recovery. The change between different basins can be very different. The Pacific is very different than the Atlantic and Indian Ocean. And a large fact that difference comes in September, October, November, which seems to be due to internal variability. Okay, so that's how the winds have changed. So the next question is, well, has that had any impact? So given previous studies, we'd expect some impact on weather systems, maybe the oceans and sea ice. So we're starting to look at that. But the first thing we need to kind of think about is, well, are these trends or change in trends that I've just discussed likely to have an impact? And it might depend on how rapidly a particular field responds to a change in the winds. So for weather systems, you might expect there's going to be a fairly instantaneous change if you change where the jet is. But if you're talking about the deep ocean circulation, that perhaps is a time integrated decadal response. And the other thing to consider is, well, does the particular aspect of the climate system depend on the zonal mean or the local winds? Again, the ocean mean meridional circulation might be more dependent on the zonal mean winds, but the subtropical gyres could be more localized. So given that the area that I've been focusing on most is the subtropical oceans. And that focus has come because, well, there's two, we'd expect, changes in, if you change the wind stress, then you'd expect a change in the ocean circulation, in particular through kind of Ekman pumping. You would expect a change in the horizontal Ekman flow at the surface in the mixed layer, which would then cause a difference in the rate of upwelling or downwelling. So you'd expect some response in the overturning circulation if you change the wind stress. Similarly, if you look at the gyre circulation through sphere drop balance, you would again expect if you change the wind stress, so tau is the wind stress, if you change the curl of the wind stress, you'd expect some change in the subtropical gyre strength. And given changes in the meridional circulation and the subtropical gyre circulation, you might expect some change in the transport of water from the surface into the interior, or the ventilations of the oceans. And I've been looking at that from the perspective of an ideal age. So the ideal age is, it's an idealized tracer that is labeled so the water is zero at the surface, and then it ages as it's transported into the interior. And so the ideal age at a given spot gives you the mean transport time from the surface to the interior. And it's analogous or the same as the age of air that's used, say, to quantify the time to air to transport from the troposphere into the stratosphere. And so the plot on the left is showing a calculation of this ideal age from a model. Not even sure which one, but it's probably CCSM4. And this is showing the age, zero at the surface, and getting at depth, it's getting to 400 or 500 years old. And we can see the youngest waters are in what are known as mode and intermediate waters. The black contours are isopycnal, so the waters transported kind of primarily along isopycnals fairly rapidly into these mode waters. But further poleward of that, you have the upwelling of what's known as circumpolar deep water, which is bringing water from depth up near the surface. And it's much older than this water here because it's been the deep ocean for centuries. So I would argue that this ideal age is important on its own right because it quantifies the transport in the ocean. But perhaps more importantly, is given this ideal age is a good proxy for the transported distribution of anthropogenic carbon. Again, this water here that's young, it's going to be bringing down water that had larger concentrations of CO2 because CO2 has increased over time, whereas the older water, which has been at depth, hasn't had contact with the surface for centuries, will have very low, if not zero, anthropogenic carbon. And so what's shown on the right is a simulation of this anthropogenic carbon for the same kind of general region, and you see high values in these mode waters and very low values in the circumpolar deep waters, which are upwelling around this region. Okay, so given that understanding of how the Southern Ocean circulation might change, we've looked at it in some model simulations. And so the first one I'm going to look at is in simulations where there's an abrupt change in the wind stress. So you have a long pre-industrial control run, and then you abruptly increase the wind stress. And the bottom of the plot is showing, in this case, there's just an increase in the wind stress between two latitudes. So the wind stress curl is increased throughout this region, which is shown here. Then, consistent with the expectations because of a sphere drop balance, there's actually a strengthening of the stream function, horizontal barotropic stream function. Now it's negative because of its sense of direction here. So the negative values mean that it's strengthening. And then, consistent with a more rapid circulation, you're getting younger ages within this isopycnal. So increase in the winds, increase in the strength of the barotropic stream function, and a decrease in the age. There's also, again, through changes in the vertical, so through Ekman pumping arguments, you would expect, when given the change in the wind stress, there's a downward movement at lower latitude, and at higher latitude there's an upward movement of these isopycnals. There's a decrease in age throughout this region, and there's also an increase in the temperature and salinity. So this is showing, it's an idealized case, but it's showing if you perturb the winds. Now this is a pretty large perturbation that's been done, so it's not, but it's just to see what the signal is. You do get these changes in the interior age, temperature, and salinity. But would we expect to see this from a pause in the wind stress? So this was a very idealized case where it abruptly increases, but that was a steady response. So this is like looking at the end of a 4 times CO2 run and just seeing how the atmosphere and oceans have changed. But we want to know, how rapidly does that happen? So the run that I looked at here was an old run that's been done by a couple of people in the audience. So there's a CCSM4 run that was described here. And there's a series of runs that were run for 100 years where ideal age was included, and seen the response to this abrupt increase in the winds. And if you look at the gyre circulation or the movement of isopycnals, that happens very quickly. It happens on the timescale of 5 to 10 years with exponential. So the dynamical response is fairly quick. And this 5 years is kind of consistent with the Rossby speed of Rossby waves to propagate across the basins. But then when we look at the response for the interior fields, the age, etc., now you're talking decades or longer. And it happens for temperature and salinity as well. So there's a fast response for the gyres and the isopycnals, but a decadal to even a century response for interior fields. So if we have a pause in the wind stress, what would we expect to see? It's a bit of a complicated figure. So to estimate that, I've used this kind of linear response theory, which is basically the response function with a simulated response to an abrupt change in the winds. And we convolve that with a kind of perturbation. So this is an estimate of how we think the wind strength has kind of increased and been a pause since 2000. So if we do this convolution and we're looking at something with a 5-year time scale, so let's say the gyre strength, so the light line here is an instantaneous response to this perturbation. The thick black curve is something with a 5-year response time. And you do see it's not a pause, but you can see there'd be a slowdown in the trend. So with something with a 5-year response time, you'd expect to see a slowdown in this trend. But if you've got a 10 or even 20, with the 20-year, there's hardly any change. It'd be very hard and near impossible to detect this change in the trend. And also any of this interannual variability is all being washed out. So these only depend on this kind of decadal changes in the wind. If you extend this calculation out to the future, there will be a pause, but it's delayed 20 or 30 years. So the slowdown in the trends in the gyre and isospectral depth or movement of that, you might be able to see, but probably not for interior age or temperature and salinity. Okay. So what about the regional difference? So we've argued that the wind trends have differed between the Pacific and the Atlantic or Indian Oceans. Would we expect to see that response in the ocean? And again, I've gone back to looking at some abrupt change runs. The previous runs that have been done with where the wind stress change, it was made everywhere across the zonally. So you couldn't look and see what the difference is between different basins. However, a group in Australia have done runs where they've done the abrupt change in forcing has gone from a neutral SAM year into a positive or a negative SAM year. And so this includes changes in the winds, the buoyancy forcing, all the atmospheric fields, but it also has some spatial variation. And the spatial variation in the wind stress with SAM is very similar, as you might expect, to the trends that have been observed over the last 20 years, 40 years. And so this plot here is showing the change in the wind stress regressed against the SAM. So a positive here means an increase in the wind stress when there's a positive SAM. And so you see the largest increases again over the Pacific Ocean. It's further, the largest increase is a bit further equatorward of where the increase is over the other oceans. And there's also over the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, the increase is clearly on the poleward side, where it's slightly on the equatorward side in the Pacific. So again, as the Pacific winds strengthen as SAM goes more positive, whereas the latitude doesn't change much, it's variable. And over the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, there's a smaller increase in the wind stress and the peak moves poleward. So we can look at these runs to decompose when you do a SAM forcing, what's the response, and interpret how does it respond to an increase in the winds over this region, whereas over the other regions it is a weaker increase further poleward. And just focus here just on the age. And so if you look at the age response, I'm not going to go into the details, you do indeed see big differences from this model over the Pacific Ocean. The age has got much younger, much smaller changes elsewhere. And then when you look at depth versus latitude profiles, you see that this increase over the Pacific happens over a large region of these mode waters, whereas in the Atlantic and Indian Ocean, there's a decrease only near where it's kind of outcropping. And these changes here are consistent with the changes in the wind stress and circulation. So we might expect to be able to see some differences in the horizontal circulation and age or the trends between the different ocean basins. Whether there has been, that's on the to-do list. Okay, so that's the second part was the simulations looking at abrupt forcing indicate that the pause in the wind trends, we might see that in the gyre circulation and movement of isopycnals, but we're probably not going to be able to detect that in age or temperature or salinity in the ocean interior. But the difference between the basins we could see in both the circulation and the mode water properties. But again, this is all kind of speculation based on idealized model runs, and so we have to start looking at the data to see if any of the above has actually occurred. Okay, that's all I have. So I guess the take-home messages are that the SAM trends have paused around 2000. I think that's the main take-home message to get here. So the people continually talk about how there's a trend in the SAM or the winds, but it stopped around 2000. And the trends differ a lot between the Pacific and Atlantic and Indian Oceans. And so that could have a big impact depending on what you're looking at in terms of the ocean response. Okay, thanks for your time.
Thanks very much, Darren, for that nice presentation. So we have plenty of time for questions. If you have a question, you can either use the raise your hand feature, which is in the participants window, or you can type your question in the chat. And I see we have our first question from Susan Solomon. Go ahead.
Nice talk, Darren. Do you worry at all about the fact that the models that you're using to look at these regional changes don't really have full coupling between what the ozone is doing and what the temperature and circulation are doing? I mean, these are, some of them at least are with fixed ozone, correct?
Yeah, yes. So some of them with fixed ozone and some of the ones at the end were the ocean only where they're prescribed wind. So yeah, I don't think I would believe or get too excited about the details of the results. I think thing to take away is the kind of the general kind of response pattern. But yes, there certainly could be couplings in there which will further kind of complicate it.
Okay, Richard Small has a question. You can go ahead and unmute.
Oh, Katie, it's actually Justin.
Hi, Justin.
My question, I liked the talk. My question related to the subantarctic mode water, and some of the models you mentioned had deficiencies in the mode water simulation, like CCSM4 had not enough volume of mode water. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on the basic biases maybe of the models used to look at some of these questions.
Yeah, I don't. Again, I think this is similar to Susan's kind of question, is that these models are by no means perfect, and so some of the quantitative stuff, there might be question marks about it in terms of especially like the mode water formation and stuff like that. And so trying to see if you can see this in the observations is what I think we need to do to see kind of how realistic these changes are. I should say that the changes in the age in I've looked at that in several different models or configurations of models, going all the way from the CCSM coupled model with parametrized mixing, all the way through to, you know, a 1/4 degree ocean only model with resolved or partially resolved kind of eddies, and the response is remarkably similar. So I don't know whether that means that they've all got the same bias or not. I don't know.
I think they probably got a range of biases, but that's a very interesting result. Thank you.
Peter, go ahead. I see your hands raised.
So, Darren, the lack of trends since 2000 has occurred while the greenhouse gases have still been increasing rather strongly. So does that indicate that these trends really are mostly due to the ozone changes? Whereas I thought that most climate models had both the greenhouse gases and the ozone causing the changes in these southern hemisphere circulations.
Yeah, so it differs between models in terms of whether they say it's primarily ozone or whether it's primarily kind of greenhouse gases. So I guess I come from the ozone camp, and so my thought is that of the 4 scenes, it's in December, January, February, it's been primarily ozone. And actually, I think there could be still a large kind of natural variability signal in there as well. But the pause, the fact that, you know, the models capture the pause, the observations show it goes with ozone, indicate that ozone has been the main driver in the trend up to 2000. And I would say most models, not all, most models, when you have done a comparison between them, they'll say that ozone signal is bigger than the greenhouse gas.
Is that in models that are like Wacom rather than just the CCSM, which then, so that Wacom has the interactive chemistry
Yeah,
and therefore the
so
signal is stronger?
Yes. So I think there's a difference. I think models that prescribe ozone and prescribe greenhouse gases still show that ozone is larger than the greenhouse gas. And then models that do a better job of representing the ozone, there's some indication that they might get a little bit better, a little bit stronger trend. But the difference is relatively small. And so I think the pause in the trend is, I think, you know, if you asked me 5 years ago whether it was ozone or greenhouse gases were making the largest role, I'd have said ozone then, just as I do now. But the pause paper, the pause result seems to me is pretty clear, because the models indicate, you know, the greenhouse gases have continued to increase. And when models, all they have is increasing greenhouse gases, they do show that trend continuing. But the pause in the trends indicate that it's ozone. And in fact, ozone has not only paused, it's actually gotten a little bit smaller. But the jet doesn't seem to show that, perhaps because there's still a signal of the greenhouse gases, which is still pushing a little bit poleward.
Okay, there's another hand raised. Wiley, go ahead.
Yeah, that's me. Thanks, Darren. Darren, your first part, you focused, I believe, for obvious reasons, on the zonal wind at 850 millibars. But then the second part, you switch over to the surface wind stress, which has both components, because you're taking curls and things. So can you just confirm that in part one, all these signals, there's nothing of interest in either the meridional or directions or switch from 850 to surface, and everything is in, all the signals are in the 850 millibar zonal wind?
I can't confirm all, but yeah, so the analysis, the first part looking at the change in the winds was all done with 850. And, you know, switch it to wind stress because that's how the ocean models or the models were forced. But I think you see a similar picture in terms of whether you're looking at the wind stress or the 850.
So there's no signal in the meridional components or anything of interest anywhere in that?
I wouldn't say there's no signal. I haven't looked at it.
Okay.
Other questions? I thought I saw Hyen's hand raised. Hyen, did you have a question? I also see that Antara responded a little bit in the chat to some of the previous discussion. Thanks for that. While we're waiting for other questions, I guess I had a question about, you know, how the continued recovery of stratospheric ozone might impact some of these trends. I mean, how do you see this changing going forward?
So, yeah, so we think, well, it's going to depend on a balance between ozone recovering and how much the greenhouse gases increase. And so I think we've seen the pause now, and whether it stays as a pause or okay, how do we fit? So we expect ozone to keep recovering slowly and the ozone hole to recover or go back to like 1980 values by 2060 or 2070. So it has a slow recovery there. At the same time, the CO2's increasing. And so those two will compete against each other. And a lot of models indicate that for the next, say, 30 years, there'll be very little trends. So the pause could continue for another 20 years or 30 years. And then what it does after that will depend on, if we do a business as usual, CO2 will just take over and it'll start moving poleward again. Or if by some miracle we get our act together and start reducing the CO2, then it might start moving equatorward. So this pause could be not just a 20-year pause. It could be a 40-year pause.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Looks like Hyen was able to type her question in, so I'll read it out here. The tropical Pacific also experiences a decadal change in around year 2000. Wonder whether that caused some of the trends you showed, especially the regional trends or shifts in the Pacific.
Yeah, so I think there would be differing arguments on that. We tried to look at this. I'm not sure this was the best way, so I went through it quickly, but we compared the trends in historical CMEP5 runs and the AMEP CMEP5 runs. So the AMEP CMEP5 runs, all the models have the same SSTs. So they would all include any kind of decadal change in this SST pattern. And we couldn't see any difference between that ensemble and the ensemble which had model generated SSTs. I don't think that doesn't mean that it's not an ocean response, but it means we couldn't isolate a SST impact versus internal atmospheric impact. But I know there are other people who are doing kind of pacemaker type things that seem to indicate there is the tropical ocean could be playing a role. I think a challenge there is that the variability is so large between models or between ensembles. So it might take some very careful experiments to try and kind of isolate which of those it is.
Mm-hmm. Sally, go ahead.
Hi, Darren.
Hi, Sally.
Thanks for the talk. Maybe you mentioned this earlier, but is there a direct connection between the ozone forcing and the Southern Ocean SST in general?
So I think there's a connection via I don't think there's much directly, but I think there's a connection through changing the winds,
Yep.
which then can modify the SSTs.
Okay, so.
But and there's issues there in terms of whether, so again, if you look in model land, when you can abruptly put an ozone hole into a model, you get a fast response in terms of the SSTs, and then there is a second response that can actually go the other side, and that second response is very model dependent.
I see.
So there's an immediate kind of, you'd say, an Ekman layer, Ekman transport response in terms of moving SSTs, but then there's other changes due to upwelling, the clouds change as well. So I think there's a lot of research going on at the moment trying to figure out what this kind of long-term SST response would be.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting because you mentioned that there's the ozone forcing pause since 2000, but I think the SST over the Southern Ocean, in particular in the Pacific sector, continues to cool after 2000 for at least like a decade or so.
Right, but so because the SSTs are going to be changing because of increasing CO2. So there's a pause in terms of the circulation, but certainly I've got to make clear that I think ozone recovery has a larger role than greenhouse gases in terms of the circulation. But if you're talking surface temperatures, no, that's dominated by greenhouse gases.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions at this point, but let's all thank Darren again, and thanks for a great talk and the great discussion. Next week, we